All right, we are now recording, and I'm now going to put us on silent for just a moment. Yes. Okay, and now everybody can hear me? Volume is okay? All right. What I would like to do tonight is to review where we have come from. We have covered actually quite a bit of time, quite a bit of history. Even if we just concentrate on what we have discussed about the Jewish people, we have covered a period beginning with the patriarchs about 1600 BCE, and we have ended last week with the destruction of the first temple in a period at about 586 BCE. So we've covered about 1,000 years, give or take, 1,000 years of history in the 6 weeks, now 7 weeks of the course that we've already taken part in. But I want to re-emphasize certain facts to you, things that weren't clear to me initially and that I wanted to emphasize to you as we go through the material. Again, I'm going to share with you just two pieces of material tonight. Most of our discussion will not be involved with you looking at a chart and me talking. We'll talk together. But as we begin, if you had to characterize in terms of the history we've covered, if you had to characterize what period of Jewish history have we covered over the 6 weeks, now 7 weeks of our course, how would anybody like to characterize what period of Jewish history we have been discussing?
Old Testament.
Joseph, go ahead.
I would say it's ancient history.
All right, ancient history, certainly, in terms of going back way to the beginning of recorded history, ancient history in terms of the civilizations we have studied, all right? So we have studied ancient history. Larry, go ahead, another term?
Documented?
Documented history, all right, yes. I, especially in the first couple of courses, tried to tell you that the events we have discussed can be corroborated by outside evidence, not only from Jewish tradition, but outside evidence as well. And so most of the history I've tried to present has not been legend. I have not just told you biblical stories. I've actually attempted to present what Larry calls documented history, history that can be confirmed by outside sources, Jewish and non-Jewish. So ancient history is one way of describing what we have covered so far. Documented or factual history is another. Anybody else want to give me another term for this period we've covered so far? Okay. Well, I'll give you the term and you'll probably say, oh yeah, biblical history. This is the history of the Bible. Okay. With tonight's lesson, we leave the period of biblical history. Now, if I say to you, we have been studying biblical history, what does that mean? When we say we have been exploring the biblical historic account of the Jewish people, what do we mean by that? Would someone like to explain what biblical history is? I'm not going to be successful in drawing any. Okay, Larry, go ahead.
Would you say documented in the Bible?
Yeah. Historical events that are documented in Hebrew sources at any rate. We find documentation, specifications of this history in the Hebrew Bible. All right. The Hebrew Bible is a valid source of history. Now, normally I would tell you that when the only source of history we have to confirm an event or a period of time is biblical accounts, I would say take that with a grain of salt, because the Bible is not always an objective account. It is, of course, a theological document which asserts very primary doctrines, very primary beliefs among the Jewish people. But yes, it is the biblical account of Jewish history. And when we say the Bible, it's important we understand what we mean by the Bible. So I'm going to ask you, first of all, go ahead, Lori, go ahead. You wanted to add something.
I just had a question. So like weekly when we read the parshas, like that is the recollection of what happened for that particular week or day in history.
When the Jewish people read weekly the Torah portion, we read over a period of 1 year the cycle of stories in the Hebrew Bible from Genesis all the way to the end of Deuteronomy that recount the history of the Jewish people, but only for a certain period, Lori, not for all of biblical history. The Torah only concerns or only deals with one particular part of the biblical story. If I ask you, Lori, what do the accounts in the book of the Torah deal with? What subject do they deal with? What would you tell me? Yeah. Well, we read every week. We come to the synagogue. We read it.
There's
5 books.
the 5 books.
The 5 books of Moses, right? And remember, the books are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It starts with a kind of a theological assertion, a theological account. In the beginning, as God was creating the heaven and the earth. There's no independent human documentation for that. When God was creating the world, we have no historical source for that. So the beginning of the story, especially the first 7 days of creation and the early stories from Adam and Eve up to the first 20 generations, these are stories where we don't find much outside documentation. They are stories. They may be accurate in some respects. They may be legends. They may have theological elements mixed in them. But these are the stories that start with the creation story, that talk about the early history of humanity, that then turn to the Jewish people, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then at the end of that first book of the Torah, Lori, you remember, we end up in Egypt with Joseph and his brothers. And the second book of the Torah immediately takes us into the period of slavery. We're told that a new Pharaoh arises over the people, a Pharaoh who does not remember what Joseph has done for Egypt in the past. All he can see is that the Jewish people are multiplying and growing. They are a non-Egyptian people, and this Pharaoh is fearful that they will represent a danger to Egypt. So what does the Pharaoh say? Let us deal wisely with this people. Let us subdue them. Let us control them so that they do not pose a problem for us. And the next 4 books of the Bible, Lori, Exodus talks about the slavery of the Jewish people, talks about the miracles that are made, God causes to occur before the Egyptian people at the hand of Moses. And then the book of Exodus actually ends with an account of the Jewish people leaving the land of Egypt, beginning their wandering throughout the Sinai desert. And actually, toward the end of the book of Exodus, we see them at the foot of Mount Sinai, where God, in this marvelous revelation, reveals himself to the people and begins to reveal his Torah. The next 3 books of the Bible deal with the 48 years of wandering. They tell you what happened to the Jewish people. They talk about the laws that Moses gave the people, but they also deal with the history of the wandering in the wilderness, the good things and the not so good things. The Jewish people are not without fault. And more than once in the account that we find in the 5 books of the Torah, the Jewish people are dissatisfied. They grumble. They have problems with what Moses is doing and questions about whether God is really among them. Until finally, we saw in the book of Numbers that at a critical moment when God has told the people that they are now ready to go in and to take possession of the land that he has promised their ancestors, the people are hesitant. They suggest to Moses that he send out scouts or spies, however you want to characterize it. They go into the land, they see the land, they come back, they bring back a report, and basically they say to the rest of the nation, we have gone to the land, we have seen it. It is indeed, as God has described it, a land flowing with milk and honey. It is a land of pastures, of hills. It's a plentiful land. They even bring back examples of some of the fruit of the land with them. But they say the people that are in the land are too powerful for us. They are mighty. They live in fortified cities. They're well armed. And there is no way, the spies finally report, there is no way that we can conceive of how we could possibly enter the land and take and conquer the enemies that are within it. At that point, you'll remember the people despair. They turn against Moses. They essentially say, why did you bring us out to die here in the wilderness? And they even go to the point of trying to appoint a new leader to rebel against Moses and to go back, as it were, to have a new leader to take them back to Egypt. At that point, God is very angry. He tells the people that they have failed the test, so to speak, that they will not go into the land that he has promised them, and that they will spend the next 38 years of their time wandering in the midst of the Sinai desert. And God tells them, all those of you who were over the age of 20 at the time of the exodus from Egypt, none of you will see the land that I've promised you. You will all die during the course of the next 38, 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And your children, who you claimed who you said would become captives of your enemies, it's your children I will take, and they will go in and occupy and conquer the land which you have failed to do. And so by the end of the story, by the end of the book of Deuteronomy, everybody who is over 20 at the time of the exodus from Egypt, they're all gone, including some of the leaders. Miriam, Moses' sister, older sister, is gone. Aaron, Moses' older brother, is gone. Even Moses himself, you'll remember, because of an incident that occurred with him and his brother and failing to sanctify God. Even Moses is told by God, because you failed to sanctify me, you too will not go into the land that I promised to give to your descendants, to your people. You will be able to see it from afar, but you will not go in. So at the very end of the books of the Torah, and this is where we come to, Lori, we have an account of the Jewish people. Moses passes away. He is mourned by the people across the Jordan from the land of Israel, and that ends the books of the Torah. That ends the Torah, but it doesn't end the Hebrew Bible, right? The Hebrew Bible goes on, because right after the 5 books of Moses, we have a book of histories that tell the history of the Jewish people. Remember the history: Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Okay, I say 1st and 2nd. We said, why were the 2 books? No, the books of Samuel and Kings were so long that they couldn't put them on one parchment. So they called them 2 books simply because they were on 2 separate parchments. But Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings is the history of the Jewish people from the conquest of the land of Canaan all the way up to the destruction of Israel, the northern kingdom, and Judah, the southern kingdom. It is the history of the Jewish people. And then as a kind of addition to those historical books, we have the books of what are called the literary prophets. The prophets were the people who lived in the times of the divided kingdom. Prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Hosea. There are a whole bunch of prophets. All these books are called the books of the prophets, the literary prophets of Israel. And then you'll have still another section, which includes writings that were written by biblical figures during this very period. Lori, I'm sorry, you have a question.
And you're probably going to answer it. So where does the Talmud and the Mishnah and the Gemara and all that, where does that come in?
Good question. All right, now let me share now a picture with you. Randy, I want to share the books of the Tanakh. Okay. Okay, and that one. Share. And I'm going to wait for just a moment to make sure that everybody is seeing the chart that we have here. And I will send a copy of this chart to you. Okay. Oh, it's a little big. Let's make it a little smaller. There you go. Can everybody see that chart? Okay. Those are the books of the Hebrew Bible. Now, the Hebrew Bible is made up of 3 sections. Let's review that. The first section, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that is called in English the law or the instruction. In Hebrew, it is called the Torah. So, Lori, when you were talking about the Torah, the books on the left-hand side of the chart, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that is the first part of the Hebrew Bible, okay? And who wrote the books of the Torah? Well, we know that exactly also. It was finally written down, committed to writing by Moses, who receives these books from God himself. And the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, that is considered to be the constitution, the way of life, the tradition, the way in which we Jews are supposed to live. That is the Torah. Now look at the middle section of books. You see the middle section? Those are called the prophets, and there are two sections in the middle. There are what are called the former or the early prophets and the later prophets. The former prophets are the historical books that take us from Moses' death to the collapse, the destruction of the first and the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel and Judah. The books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Those are the history books of the Jewish people. They pick up where the Torah leaves off, the death of Moses on the eve of the conquest, and they take us with Joshua into the conquest of the land. Joshua and his generation pass away. Initially, the people are ruled by local officials and charismatic military officials called judges. And finally, as time goes on and the Jewish people face stronger and stronger enemies, in the time of Samuel and in the books of Kings, the Jewish people demand is a strong word, they ask that they be led by kings, not merely local leaders anymore, not judges, but they want to be led by a king. They ask Samuel to anoint for them a king. And that is the books of Samuel and Kings talk about all the kings of the united monarchy, Saul and David and Solomon. By the way, just an interesting point. Do you know how long the total reigns of Saul, David, and Solomon last? Do you have any idea how long a period that is? Anybody? Will shock you to learn less than 100 years. Saul and David and Solomon. Saul begins he is the first king in 1020, and Solomon ends his kingship in 930. So in 90 years, what was called the united or the unified kingdom of Israel and Judah only lasted for about 90 years, less than 100 years. And what happens afterward? Afterward, in the book of Kings, it says, when Solomon dies, the kingdom is divided into two parts, the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, and the southern kingdom called the kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, does not last all that long. Believe it or not, the northern kingdom only lasts for about 210 years, from the rise of the first kings in the northern kingdom to the end, about 210 years. The southern kingdom lasts longer, but that only lasts for about 344 years. What happens at the end of that period? The kings of Israel are defeated. And first in the north, in Israel, the tribes in the north are conquered by the Assyrians, and then the tribes in the south are conquered by the Babylonians. And that marks the end of the history of the kingship. It marks the end, really, of Jewish autonomy in the land of Israel. Now, along with the books of Joshua, Judges, Saul, and Kings, we also have the books of the prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, those are the main three. And then we have 12 minor prophets, Amos, Hosea, Habakkuk, Jonah, Micha. There are 12 different names. These are all literary prophets. They all lived during the time of the kings. The point being, all those writings were called pre-exilic writings, which means all those compositions in the middle section were composed before the destruction of Israel and Judah. The last section, take a look at the section on the right of your screen, those are called the writings. Some of them go back to the early beginning. Some of them are much later. For example, we believe that many of the Psalms that we have in the book of Psalms were written by King David and other authors of his time. The books of Job, Proverbs, Ruth, the Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, all those books are also believed to have been written before the destruction of Israel and Judah, before the destruction of the northern and the southern kingdoms. Then you look below that and you see a group of writings which are called post-exilic writings, which means the writings that I mentioned at the bottom are all writings that are believed to have been written after the destruction of the northern and southern kingdom. These were writings that did not appear until after the destruction of the Jewish kingdoms. And all these writings were the last of the books to be included in the Hebrew Bible. Lamentations, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, the book of Chronicles, all those books are considered post-exilic, which means they are still part of the Hebrew Bible, but they weren't composed or finally accepted until the period after the destruction of the northern and southern kingdoms. Those 24 books, you can count them and I'll send you a copy of it. Those 24 books that you see, the 5 books of the law, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 books in the book of prophets, and all the rest of the books under the writings, all 24 volumes of that are known in Hebrew as Tanakh. And just to remind you where the term Tanakh comes from, it comes from the first section called Torah, T, the second section called prophets, which in Hebrew is Nevi'im, and the last section, which is called the writings, which is Ketuvim, T-N-C-H, Tanakh. Tanakh is the Jewish word for the Hebrew Bible. We don't call it the Old Testament. We don't believe there's a New Testament, therefore ours is the Old Testament. We believe these are the books of Revelation given by God to the Jewish people over the period of time that constitutes their history. Any writings that are not included in these 24 books are not part of Hebrew scripture. They are not part of the Hebrew Bible. So you will find that there are books that are part of a section called the apocalyptic literature. They are not included in this section. The book of Jubilees, the book of Maccabees, other books like that, they were never canonized. They never were accepted as being holy scripture. Therefore, only these 24 separate books are part of the Hebrew Bible. And this is what among Christian scholars they would call the Old Testament, meaning the covenant that God made with Israel. In Christianity, it is believed that God made an initial covenant with the Jewish people. The people he had selected to carry his word. And then in the doctrine and the teaching of the church, God at a certain point turns away from that covenant and creates a new covenant with a new group of people, which now includes anybody who believes in additional texts, which would be texts that would be found in the New Covenant, or what we call the New Testament. So that is the books of the Hebrew Bible. Most of those books have already been written. The only books that we have yet to study, that we'll mention this week, are the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, the book of Daniel. Esther, of course, was written during the time of the Persian exile because it deals with Persia. The books at the very end, the last 5 books, we believe those were the last books of the Hebrew Bible to be composed, and they were all accepted. When was this finally closed? When did the rabbis put a stop to it and say, that's it, there are no more holy books? All those took place sometime before the year, I say around the year 200 BCE. If you go to the period of 200 BCE, which would put it in the time of the Hellenistic age, there are no books that are included. The book of Maccabees, which tells a story which we Jews celebrate on the holiday of Hanukkah, the book of the Maccabees is not found in the Hebrew Bible. There are 4 books of the Maccabees. There's Maccabees 1, 2, 3, and 4. None of them are found in the Hebrew Bible. We call those apocrypha, which means they are outside the recognized canonical text, because though there is much of historical validity to those books, they were never accepted as holy books. And therefore, the book of Maccabees are not included. There are other books that are that were written after the close of this period, which also didn't make it. So basically, the books that we have on the chart are the books of the Hebrew Bible. Go ahead, Joseph.
Rabbi, is there, in terms of this history, where would the Dead Sea Scrolls lie? And are any of the Dead Sea Scroll writings part of the biblical, part of the Bible?
Very good. Joseph is referring to a group of scrolls which were discovered actually in modern times. They were discovered at about the time the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel, was coming into being, the 1940s. They were discovered in a community near the Dead Sea, thus they are called the Dead Sea Scrolls. The name of the community, we believe, was Qumran. It was a community that had lots of scrolls, and the scrolls that this community preserved and protected and managed to will to us in a later generation, those books include all of the books of the Bible that you see in front of you. If you're looking at the books of the Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls contain either whole parts or significant portions of all of the books you see in front of you. But in addition to those writings, those official, those sanctified writings, the writings that were considered holy in Jewish tradition, the people in the Dead Sea Scrolls, who we believe to be a community of Essenes, also had other texts and other versions of other books, which were they also saved and which were also discovered when the Dead Sea Scrolls were finally brought to light in the 1940s. So Joseph, I would tell you that while the Dead Sea Scrolls contain large portions of many other books of the Bible you see in front of you, it also contains material that is not part of any of these sections of the Hebrew Bible. And it contains very early versions of these books. So sometimes when you compare the Dead Sea Scrolls with the later official copies of these canonized texts, you will see there are slight differences, not major differences, but there are differences of words, of phrasing here and there. So despite the fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls are an authoritative record of the earliest Hebrew scriptures, it includes more than just these sacred texts. Okay. And those of you who have not had an opportunity yet, believe it or not,
No,
it's not there anymore.
I think the other day was the last
Oh,
day.
well, there were still a couple days left.
I could be
All right.
wrong.
I thought it was still at the Reagan Library. If it's not, then it's
Okay.
too late. But the point is,
I could be wrong.
there was a wonderful exhibit at the Reagan Library. Some of you, I know, some of us had a chance to view it, and it is truly amazing. And when you actually go to the library and you see the fragments of these texts or
Rabbi,
yes,
I think it's still there because that sisterhood has a field trip going there
Oh,
on
yeah,
May
I'm
18th.
so sorry. It goes through September 2nd. I
All
was
right.
totally wrong.
for those of you who have missed, who did not see it, you have
September
through
2nd.
September 2nd. They have kept it over because it has been hugely successful. You're right, Susanna. I think our sisterhood, Beth Shalom, is going to be going. If you have not seen it, it is wonderful. Even those of you who have seen the Dead Sea Scrolls in Israel,
This is
we've seen
better.
them in Israel too, but the exhibit that they have at the Reagan Library is so wonderfully done, so beautifully orchestrated and choreographed and put together that I found it even more powerful seeing the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Reagan Library than I did seeing a much larger collection of them in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. So those of you who have a chance, who want to see these kinds of these documents, including texts of scrolls we are familiar with, you can still see it at the Reagan Library up until September.
I concur. It was beautiful. Carol and I went. It was really excellent, Rabbi.
You did have a chance to go to Ira. I'm glad you
Yes.
enjoyed it. Joseph and Paula and Randy and I had a chance to go see it. If you have not had a chance to see it, I can unreservedly and without hesitation recommend that you go to see it. It is just that good. And short of going to Israel itself and seeing the entire collection, because of course they didn't move the entire collection to the Reagan Library, but they have removed excellent, the selections that they have chosen are perfect. And the way that it has been mounted and the information and the audio tapes and whatnot that you can listen to as you go through the Reagan Library and see these exhibits is outstanding. So for those of you who have not already gone, I truly recommend that you go. But here's the point. All of the books of the Hebrew Bible that we have spoken of up until now, and we will add now Ezra and Nehemiah, and I think that Ezra, Nehemiah, and Daniel, and Esther, all those books were written earlier. The post-exilic writings were written after the destruction of the temple. It was written after the destruction of the northern and the southern kingdom. And so we call this period by another name. We call this, by the way, the biblical period. We don't call it the period of the Torah, although some people might say that's a Torah period. Some people say this is the period of the Tanakh, Torah, prophets, and writings. They'll say this is the period of the Tanakh. But most people, when they cover this particular history of Judaism, which we have covered and pretty much ended with last week's session, the destruction of the kingdom of Judah, following by over 100 years, the destruction of Judah, this is called biblical history. Why? Because this history is largely contained and reflected in the books of the Bible. So when we speak of biblical history, that is now going to come to an end. Books that will now appear, except for the few that I'm showing you on the right-hand side at the bottom, these will not be included anymore in the Bible. We will give these books in this period a new name. it will no longer be called the biblical period. I'm going to take us off screen and we'll talk about it. All right, we're back. This is no longer called the biblical period. When the biblical period or the ancient period or whatever you want to call it, Jewish history is over, it gives rise to a new period. What is the period after the biblical period called? Does anybody have any idea? If the first part is the biblical history of Israel, what's the second part? Joseph?
The Middle Ages?
Not Middle Ages yet, because Middle Ages properly cannot be applied until sometime around the year 400 to 500 AD. It's not yet Middle Ages. It's not the middle period. It still will include antiquity. This includes ancient Greece. It includes ancient Rome. It's not considered biblical anymore. Jews who lived in the time of Babylonia, in times of Persia or Greece or Rome, didn't live in the biblical period anymore. They lived in what period did they live in? Anybody? I'll give you go ahead. Yes, go ahead. Is that Mike? Marlene, yeah. Mike, how are you?
Thank you.
My condolences to you, by the way. You're
Thank
passing
you.
your brother.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you. Is this called the rabbinical period?
It's called the rabbinic period. All
Okay.
right. If you wanted to know what this period was, this is the rabbinic period. No longer when we refer to this period do we call it the biblical period. The biblical period ends with the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah, and the exile of the Jewish people to Babylonia. After that period of time, when the Jewish people are allowed to return back to their land, it is no longer the biblical period. Mike is correct. It is called the rabbinic period. We'll talk about why in a little bit. There's another way to call this period too, if you want a second way of referring to it. The period of biblical history from the time of King Solomon when he built the temple in about 950, up until the time that the first temple was destroyed in 586. Another word for this period of Jewish history is called the First Temple period. The First Temple period. In Jewish history, there have only been 2 temples so far. We're waiting for the third. Everything that happened from the time King Solomon built the temple, about the year 950 or so BCE, up until the destruction of that temple in the year 586 BCE. Everything that happens between the building of that temple and the destruction of that temple, that entire period of biblical history is referred to as the First Temple period, because that was the period during which King Solomon built the original temple. That was the period during which the temple offered offerings, and the temple was famous throughout the region of the world because of the magnificence of the temple. It was also the temple that was eventually destroyed by the Babylonians in 586. When the Jewish people return to the land of Israel, and we'll come back to that in just a moment, there's another name for the next period of history. You know what the next period of history is called? Actually, it's pretty simple. If the first period was called the First Temple period, the next period is called the Second Temple period. Okay? The Second Temple period begins about 520 or so BC, when the Jews are given permission by the Persians to return back to the land of Judah and back to Jerusalem, when they are given permission once again to return back to their lands, because the Babylonians destroyed the Second Temple. The Jews went into exile for about 50 years. The Babylonians were defeated by the Persians, and the first Persian king who defeated the Babylonians, a man by the name of Cyrus the Great. The year after Cyrus conquers Babylonia, he gives permission to all of the different peoples that had been conquered by the Babylonians. He gives them permission in a document called the Edict of Cyrus. He gives them permission to return back to their individual lands and reestablish their ancient traditions. The Jewish people, about the year 538, in this document, the Edict of Cyrus, are given permission, those who want, to return to Jerusalem, to return to the destroyed area of the land of Judah. Not all Jews had been exiled, only a certain number of them. Cyrus gives them permission to return, to rebuild their temple, and to reestablish their national life in their ancestral homeland, with one distinction. Even though they get to return to their ancient kingdom, they are no longer an independent kingdom. They are subject to the Persian Empire. Israel will not be independent now for a long time. From the time of Cyrus, 539 BCE, to the time of Alexander, about 331 BCE, for that period of time, about 200 years, the Jews will be subject, even though they have their priests, and even though they have rebuild their temple on a small scale, and even though they have their religious traditions back again, they're back in their homeland, they are not independent. They must recognize and pay not only homage to, but they must also pay tribute to the kingdom of Persia. They are part of the Persian kingdom. And therefore, even though Judea is its own place, its own area, governed by its own laws, they are still subject to the rules and the laws of the kings of Persia. And if you think that that doesn't mean anything, about a month and a half ago, we celebrated a holiday called Purim, where a Persian king by the name of
Ahasuerus.
Achashverosh, thank you. Achashverosh is convinced by his royal minister, a man by the name of Haman. Haman says to the king, you know, your majesty, there's a certain people among your 127 different kingdoms and provinces. There is one particular people that are difficult, and they don't follow your law, and they're nothing but trouble, and it doesn't profit your majesty to allow them to continue. Give me permission, this man Haman says, to deal with them, to wipe them out, to destroy them. I'll take care of them for you. I will annihilate them, and I will confiscate all of their wealth, all of their possessions, and I will turn it over to the king's treasury, and therefore you will have all of the wealth. All I want is the satisfaction of doing away with this rebellious people. And we came perilously close to losing everything, because you remember that was the story of Esther and Mordecai. That is when Esther and Mordecai intercede on behalf of the Jewish people, and they reveal to King Achashverosh, they reveal the plot of Haman. Achashverosh, when he realizes he is being duped by his evil prime minister, arranges to have Haman and his sons hung. He then gives the Jews permission to defend themselves against the enemies who had planned to destroy them. And so what could have been a tragedy turns out to be a day of celebration and joy after all. But it came perilously close. That was the danger of Jews living under the authority of another nation. So long as Jews are not an independent kingdom, so long as they are dependent upon the good wishes, the friendliness of stronger powers, they are always subject to whatever those stronger powers decide to do, okay? Basically, that means that in any given time, there can be good rulers, but there can also be bad rulers. And though the Jews may enjoy periods of prosperity, they can also enjoy periods of persecution. This endures throughout the 200 years from 539 all the way to 334. During that entire 200-year period, for the most part, the Jews are okay. The Jews are given their autonomy. They're allowed to govern their own lives. So long as they pay tribute to the Persian Empire, so long as they do not align with any foreign powers against Persia, they're going to be allowed to live their lives, and they're not going to be harmed, and they're not going to be treated even as an enemy population. The Jews who live in the land of Judea during this period of 200 years, during the Persian period, are for the most part free to practice their religion, and with the recognition that they cannot do anything subversive against the Persian Empire, they have a great deal of autonomy. All that ends in the year 334. In the year 334, after a couple of centuries of relatively good living, of non-interference, a new power arises, this time not out of the east. This new power arises from the west. It arises from the son of a man, the man who is responsible for this new era is called Alexander. If Cyrus was Cyrus the Great, Alexander will be Alexander the Great. Alexander's father was not Greek. He actually came from a kingdom north of Greece called Macedonia. And Alexander of Macedonia in 334 begins to wage a war against the Persian Empire. That war will last for 3 years. From 334 till 331, Alexander brings his armies, not only from Macedonia, but also from Greece. He brings his forces from the west. They invade the east, and they manage to conquer a good portion of the east, including the kingdom of Persia. In 331, the kingdom of Persia is replaced by the kingdom of Alexander of Macedonia. Now, does that mean that the Jews suddenly have a new ruler? Not right away. The first few years, it takes a while, but within about a period of 5 years, 6 years after the defeat of the Persians, Alexander and the Hellenists, the people of Greece, will now exert rule. They will become the empire over the, they will become the empire which has authority over the kingdom of Judah. From this point on, the Jews will no longer be subject to the Persian kingdom. They will now be subject to the Hellenistic kingdom. At first, that kingdom is represented by this man, Alexander. There's a wonderful story about Alexander. I don't know if you know it. Alexander marches into the Middle East. He not only conquers all the way through the Middle East, he conquers Persia, he goes into India, he goes into areas that we would now call Pakistan. He actually, as a conqueror, conquers more territory than most other conquerors in the history of the world, including Napoleon. Alexander dies at the height of his conquest. He is in his conquest. He is in his conquest in Asia. He becomes sick. And as a young man in his late 30s or early 40s, he dies in the midst of the conquest. And the record says that he was surrounded in his death by his major generals. And the question was asked of Alexander on his deathbed, to whom should go your kingdom? In other words, it was clear he was dying. And those who were left said, who you are giving your kingdom to. And according to tradition, I don't know if it's authoritative or not, Alexander is reported to have said, to the strongest. So who was to get Alexander's kingdom? Alexander did not designate any one person. He said on his bed, the kingdom shall go to the strongest. And in fact, there wasn't one strongest. Alexander's kingdom after his death was divided into 3 separate parts. There was the part that was represented by Macedonia and Greece, the powers in the West. That part of Alexander's empire went to his heirs, immediate heirs, and went to the powers of the West. But his entire Eastern Empire, which included Egypt, which included most of the Middle East, all the way up to India, that was divided between 2 of his generals. Alexander's 2 major generals who took the rest of the empire in the East were the general in the south who ruled over the empire, the lands of Egypt, and his name was Ptolemy. Ptolemy spelt with a P, by the way, Ptolemy, P-T. And the other part of his empire to the north and to the east went to a general called Seleucid. So the Ptolemies and the Seleucids were jointly the inheritors of Alexander's empire. When Alexander died, after having conquered not only the West, but having conquered most of the Near East as well, when he died, the Near East was divided among his 2 generals, the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Assyria. Now, for the next 200 years, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids fought with one another as to who was going to control Israel, Palestine, whatever you want to call it. At first, for the first 100 years or so, a little under 100 years, it was the Ptolemies in Egypt who ruled over the area of what we would call Judea or Israel or Palestine, or however we want to call it. But for the second period of time, the Ptolemies lost power to the kingdom in the north called the Seleucids. And so for that period of 200 years, from about the year 331 or 325, when Alexander takes control of the area, up until the year 145, for the first part of that period, the Ptolemies are in control. The second part, it's the Seleucids. And each one of them rules for a period of about 100 years. And then what happens at the end of that period of time is the Jewish people, amazingly enough, manage to restore their own kingdom again. That's the period of the Maccabees. Okay, so let us now take a look once more at our chart. Can we go back to the other chart?
Which
Just,
one?
yeah, okay, just our share.
This one?
And no, it's the timeline.
Oh.
Okay.
They can see it. I promise you they can see it.
Once more, just to review, you all have this timeline. I hope I'll send out another copy with this. Let's review quickly the historic periods. I say that it begins with the time of the patriarchs, 1600 BCE. I'm convinced that the patriarchs don't begin that early. My own feeling is the patriarchs period actually goes to sometime around 1500 BCE. The Jewish people leave Egypt in the year 1250 BCE. By the way, you may think that the Jewish people were slaves in Egypt for 210 years. That is not correct. 210 years represents the time that the Jews were in Egypt from the time Joseph's family came down to join him all the way to the time that the Jews left. During the first part of the period, the Jews were welcomed as guests. For the first part of that period, during Joseph's life and the life of his brothers, they were treated very well by the Egyptians. The actual period of servitude, of slavery, which was divided into two parts, goes back between 880, between the year, hold on, let me get this right, goes back between the years, I made my notes here, hold on. Goes back to the period of, whatever I have it here, oh, goes back to the period of, hold on just a moment, please. The first part of the period of the Exodus, the first 200 years, first 100 years or so are a good period of time. That the last 86 to 116 years are the period of slavery. Slavery did not last for 210 years. Those of you who thought that Jews were slaves in Egypt for 210 years, that is not correct. The 210 years includes the entire stay from the time Joseph's brothers and father joined Joseph in Egypt all the way to the end. The actual period of slavery was somewhere between 86 and 116 years. In 1250, they leave. They wander in the wilderness for about 40 years. About the year 1210, they come to the land of Canaan. In 1210, they are led by a man named Joshua, and Joshua's conquest of the initial land of Israel lasts 7 years. So from about 1210 to about 1200, that is the period of Joshua. From 1200 to 1020 is the period of the judges. That's 180 years. Saul reigns for 20 years. 1020 to 1000. David reigns for about 30 years, from 1000 to 970. King Solomon reigns for 40 years, from 970 to 930. In 930, the kingdom of Israel and Judah are divided, and from 930 until first the northern kingdom and then the southern kingdom are conquered, that is the period of the divided kingship of Israel. Following 586, we now enter the period called the Rabbinic period, or what we also call the Second Temple period. During this period of time, it is the Second Temple that exists, no longer the First Temple. All right, so now I'm going to stop and give anybody a chance to raise questions. Craig, go ahead.
Rabbi, I apologize for taking you back. As a follow-up to Lori's question, is there, and I should know this, but is there something in the Torah that tells you that you're in different parts of the Torah after the 5 books of Moses that brings in the judges and everything? Is there,
yes,
we would call it a title
yes,
or something
yes. If
that
you
tells
have,
you that you're in something separate? I
yes.
personally have never seen it.
Okay, if you have a text Craig, of the Hebrew Bible, it is divided into 3 sections. Now, I don't know which text of the Hebrew Bible you have, but if you have a complete Tanakh, this Hebrew Bible, it is divided into the first section called Torah. That portion is set apart. It ends with the death of Moses. The second portion of the Hebrew Bible is called the prophets. And that is the entire middle portion of the Hebrew Bible. And it goes from the time of Joshua till the end of the kingdom of Israel and includes all the books of the prophets. The third section of the Hebrew Bible, which is also marked separately, Craig, it's marked in its own separate section, is called the writings. So if you look at a book of the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh, you will see it is divided into Torah, prophets, and writings. That's the way it is referred to. In Hebrew, it is Torah, Nevi'im, which means prophets, and Ketuvim, which means writings.
Are there titles for all of this?
Yes, there are. Not only each of the 3 major sections, but each of the major books of the Hebrew Bible has its own, is divided into separate books. Let me show you.
Talking about the Bible, you were talking about this before.
If you want to purchase one, this is about the best I know. This is the Hebrew Bible, okay? This is the book by Art Scroll. It has commentaries and everything. And I'm going to show you where the 3 divisions are. The first division is called the Torah. So I will show you how much of these books is the Torah. Okay, so Craig, here, I'm going to show you now. In my left hand, this first section here, right here, that's a Torah. The next page, Craig, if you look at it, has a different title. The next section is called the prophets. And in there are all the books of the prophets. That is the second section of the Hebrew Bible. That section goes on to the third section. I will show you that section. I'll show you all 3 sections. Okay, and it looks like this. Okay, it looks like this. So I'm going to show you the 3 sections. Okay. Okay, I hope you can appreciate it from what I'm showing you, but hopefully you can. These are the 3 sections, Craig, of the Hebrew Bible. I'm going to try and hold it up so everybody can see. Can everybody see 3 sections? This section over here is the Torah, Craig. These are the 5 books of Moses. These are the books of the Torah, from Genesis to Moses' death. These books in the beginning are called the prophets. They are the historical books of the Hebrew Bible from Joshua's time all the way to the destruction of the kingdom. And the third section, Craig, over here, where my finger is, that is called the writings. That includes books like Psalms, Proverbs, the 5 Megillot scrolls. That is the third section. If you get a Hebrew Bible, Craig, you will see that not only is each section specially marked and indicated as separate, but each of the individual books of that section are also delineated and marked. So if you wanted to, all you would have to do is go in and get a Hebrew Bible, a Tanakh, whatever you want to call it, Holy Scriptures if you want, and it will contain everything that is considered scripture in Jewish tradition.
Rabbi, is
Yes.
any part of the Sabbath service, does it include any part of the prophets and the writing? Do you ever go to that point other than the Torah that I normally see out?
Yes. For those of you who go to the synagogue regularly, you get to read from all 3 sections of the Torah. What do I mean? Every single week for the 52 weeks of the lunar calendar, you read a separate section of the Torah. Each week you read one section of the Torah, and the Torah is divided into 52 reading portions. But in addition to the Torah, Ira,
That's what I'm asking.
yes, you read a section from the books of the prophets. That is what is called in the synagogue the Haftorah. Torah is from the 5 books of Moses, but the concluding lesson, always connected with the theme of the weekly Torah portion, is called the Haftarah, which is completely different, and that's from the book of the prophets. And then on the special holidays, you read other books. For example, on the 5 major holidays of the Jewish year, you read from the books of the writings. You read on the book on Passover, you read Song of Songs. On Shavuot, you read the book of Ruth. On Tisha B'Av, you read the book of Lamentations. And let's see, on the holiday of Sukkot, you read the book of Ecclesiastes, and then on Purim, you read from the book of Esther. So you're reading from each of the sections. Not only that, but in every prayer service, Ira, and that part of every service, we read large selections from the book of Psalms, which is also the third part of it. So between reading from the Psalms, reading the Torah, reading the Haftorah, you are reading from all parts of the Bible every time you go to the synagogue on every given Shabbos.
Thank you.
And if you want to know the important parts, are all important, but the major part, what the rules by which we govern our lives come from the Torah. That's the first part of the Hebrew Bible.
Okay, Rabbi?
Yes.
The book you're holding up, the Tanakh, is that the Schottenstein edition?
Yes. It's not, it was the Schottenstein edition, Larry. I'll show you 2 books now.
Allison.
Yeah, I'll show you 2 books. Let's see. Yeah, here. What Larry has called the Schottenstein version, that's this book here. This is the Chumash.
Right.
Okay, so when you go to the synagogue, Larry, you would read from this. This is the
Yeah.
book which contains each of the weekly Torah portions, the Haftorah portions. This is the book you read. For the Hebrew Bible, which looks amazingly like it, but is different, this one is called the Stone edition of the Chumash. And this one is called the Stone edition of the, let's see, hold on, of the Tanakh.
Okay, because that's what I was looking at, and I'm saying this could not be what you were talking about.
No, these are 2
Yeah.
separate books.
Yeah, so I'm online with it. I'm looking at it right now. I'm trying to find it because I wanted to order it.
Okay, if you see the one that says Chumash, that's just the first part of the Hebrew Bible. That's a Torah.
That's
The one
right.
that says Tanakh, that's all those. That's the complete set. Complete
And
books.
I can't find that one book,
Which one?
the one that
Yeah.
you're holding.
We'll send it to you.
I'll send you the information. It's called the Stone Edition, and I will send you all the information. so you
Yeah,
can
so
order
send
it.
me if you can, because I'm in line with the scroll right now, Art Scroll, and I can't find it. But
Okay,
that doesn't mean
all
it's
part of
not
Art
here.
Scroll. It's all part of Art Scroll. So Larry, you can find this all if you go to Art Scroll Publishers. It will have the Torah or the Chumash. Chumash means the 5 books, and then it'll have the Tanakh.
I'm fine looking at it.
All right, we've covered a lot today. I'm remolding what I'm attempting to cover in the next couple of portions. Where are we as we end? The last period, the period of the Persian exile, of the Persian Empire, is the last part of the biblical story. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which were the 2 prophets who returned, were given permission by Cyrus, the king of Persia, were given permission to return back to the land of Israel, to rebuild the temple, to reestablish Jewish life. The books of the prophets Ezra and Nehemiah are found are part of the post-exile text. The book of Daniel, which is apocalyptic, is post-exilic. I'll send you a list, and you can, if you should be able to find a Hebrew Bible, you can see where each section falls in the Hebrew text. Anybody else? Yes, go ahead, Jay.
I'm sorry. One point I want to point out is that the Dead Sea Scrolls have been removed from the Israel Museum, the original ones. They made copies of them to leave in the museum. The rest of them have been hidden away. And so I think the ones in the Reagan Library are actually the original.
You are absolutely right, Jay. When you go to see the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Reagan Library, you are in fact probably not seeing the actual originals. It would be too difficult to send those scrolls out. But I must tell you, they have done an excellent job. Those of you who've seen this, they have done an excellent job in duplicating them and photographing them and whatnot. So even though you will not see the actual scrolls, you will see reproductions, very accurate reproductions of what they are. You won't see the original scrolls. You will see what in fact is a facsimile of the original scrolls. The original scrolls, by the way, are rarely seen. Even if you go to Israel and if you go to the Shrine of the Book, which is part of the Israel Museum, you will not see all of the scrolls. Some of those scrolls are much too delicate to handle. As a matter of fact, I remember, Joseph, when we were there, they talked about how they took scrolls that couldn't even be opened up because they were afraid by opening them up, they would break, they would crack open. They found a way to digitally unwrap them.
CT scanning.
Hmm?
The CT scan, they put them under CT scan, and that's how they were able to get under the layers and see.
So imagine that they use a CT scan to, while they were still rolled up, they were able to internally take documents of them and unscroll them literally so you can see what it looks like. It is an amazing process just to see the technology involved in how they went about uncovering and interpreting and translating the scrolls is amazing. All right, Joseph, go ahead.
You saying something?
Rabbi, at what period or what years were the very last prophets?
What is the period of time for the last prophets? I can tell you pretty much exactly. The last prophets don't go too much later than 430 BCE. The very last of the prophets. Remember, Israel was the Second Temple was destroyed in 586. They were given permission to go back by Cyrus in 539. About 100 years later, that was the last of the prophetic writing that there were. There were no more prophets after the prophet Malachi.
So then the Maccabees weren't prophetic. They didn't get prophecy.
No, it was not prophetic. As a matter of fact, one of the problems you have is with the last of the prophets, the literary prophets, there are no more prophets. God doesn't speak through prophets anymore. From now on, if you want to know what God wants of us and what he wants us to do, you don't turn to the prophets anymore. You turn to the experts who've studied God's law. You turn to the rabbis, and they'll interpret the Torah and tell you what you're supposed to do. But the period of God speaking to the prophet, even though God would never contravene what he has said before, but God does not communicate through prophets after about 430 or about 100 years, Joseph, after the Jews are given permission to go back to their land. There are no more prophets. From that point on, God communicates not through prophecy, but through scholars who study his law and interpret his text and apply certain principles. And that becomes the bookmen, the sofrim, the scribes, the rabbis. That's why it's called.
So pretty much the rabbinic period comes after the last prophet.
Right after, in fact, it says that the men of the great assembly, who were the first rabbis, follow immediately after the last of the prophets. It's, in other words, when God ends one mode of communication, he creates another mode of communication. So when he says that I will no longer communicate my word through prophets, he provides an institution called the men of the great assembly, who are scholars, who will thereafter be the ones who will interpret God's laws, and through certain principles, hermeneutic principles and whatnot, they will determine for the people what God's law is, based not on the word of God, but based on the word of God as revealed in the text. Okay. Go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, and you covered this, and I kind of missed it. When the first temple was destroyed,
yes,
Israel was conquered. But from if I remember correctly, Jewish people more or less stayed together, and they kept the Torah together, and they kept the Torah teachings together. When Judah was conquered, the tribes were dispersed. And
opposite way around, Larry. When Israel was conquered, they were dispersed. When Judah was conquered, it stayed together.
Oh.
And the reason it stayed together, Larry, we will talk about next week, because while the Jews were still in the Persian Empire, they had created a new institution that will come to, in some ways, not replace the temple, but to support the temple. That will be called the synagogue. If Judaism continues on, it's because among the Jews who were conquered by Babylonia and then were given permission to return by Cyrus, the Persian Empire, they continue on because they maintain a strong community structure based around the new institution, the synagogue, around the new kind of teaching called the rabbinic teaching. And that is how Judaism will survive. It will
And
survive.
this was Judah.
This is Judah.
And it conquered Israel. They just dispersed. And
Yeah, Israel, I looked at an article, it said, what happened with Israel? And they said, while we can't say that they completely disappeared, we can say that there is no indication of any kind of organizational structure for Israel after it was destroyed by the Assyrians in 721. From that point on, when the Assyrians exiled large elements of the tribes from northern Israel and dispersed them to all other parts of the Assyrian Empire, they, for the most part, lost contact. They were, for the most part, lost. I would say, quite simply, that most of them probably just assimilated. They didn't hold together. They couldn't hold together. They weren't strong enough and organized enough and united enough so that when the Northern Kingdom was destroyed, there was no way of keeping them together through the period they needed to be together in order to retain their Jewish tradition. Okay, well, thank you all. Oh, yeah.
Alice, look at Alice is there.
Alice.
Alice.
Oh, Alice, you're there. Hi, Alice. Hi, Alice, I called you yesterday. I didn't get to your room, but I called the hospital. They said that they thought you might actually be getting out possibly this week. So I hope everything is going well. I hope you're doing good. You don't have to answer me, but I'll call you again tomorrow and see. And again to Mike, my condolences on the loss of your brother. He was an English Jew. He was in London, I believe. Is he a rabbi? He was a rabbi. Mike's brother was a rabbi, and I remember stories about him all through the years. And I know, Mike, that he has just recently passed away.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, everyone else, I will see you next week. Good night.
Sorry we
Thank you,
missed.
Rabbi.
Do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, it's okay. We'll see. Everything is online, and
Yeah, we're gonna do it. We're gonna.
All right.
We'll catch up.
We'll
All
catch
right.
up.
Good night.
Okay, good
Good
night.
night.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
That was nice.